Welcome to the first ever Virtues and Vocations Conference on higher education and human flourishing. For those of you I know, welcome. For those of you whom I have yet to meet, my name is Suzanne Shanahan. I direct the Center for Social Concerns here at Notre Dame, which is the institutional home for the Virtues and Vocations Project. Virtues and Vocations is a national forum bringing together scholars and practitioners across disciplines to consider how best to cultivate character and moral purpose in higher education and the professions. At its heart, Virtues and Vocations is an aspiring movement of sorts, a social movement seeking to build community around the pressing questions of character facing our professions today. This conference is part of that national movement and one of the ways we hope to promote a cross-professional dialogue on character. Virtues and Vocations is in part sponsored through the generosity of the Kern Family Foundation. So what are we up to for the next 2 days? Whole lot's gonna happen. We hope that the next 2 days offer you moments of inspiration, but also moments of quiet reflection. We hope these cross-profession conversations offer both clarity and complexity for your own work, whether you're writing a new book or designing a new course. We hope that the spaces for exploration and socializing allow you to enjoy time with old friends as well as make new ones. We hope you find our time together both restorative and energizing. And finally, we hope you have come to have some seriously good fun. Good fun that reminds you of the great joy and privilege it is to do this important work. Before I turn it over to David Go, let me just say we are absolutely thrilled to bits to have you here. You are the most extraordinary group of character scholars and practitioners. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Center for Social Concerns and Notre Dame more broadly, welcome. David Go will do our formal introduction, but first, a word of thanks. The core team for Virtues and Vocation is small but mighty. Judy Benchar, Aaron Miller, and Wes Cisco are the most extraordinary trio. As you will see throughout the next 2 days, they have attended to every imaginable and unimaginable detail, whether programmatic or logistical. And more importantly, they have done so with alacrity, humor, and indeed love. They give new meaning to the notion of radical hospitality. Yes, I do believe Judy Benchar was at the airport at 1 a.m. last night, hoping to retrieve a stranded traveler. And this hospitality is precisely why I will bet anyone in this room that someone's comment on our after-conference survey will be that the very best thing about this conference is either Judy, Aaron, or Wes. It happens every single time. These three will be joined over the next couple of days by 4 other fabulous folks from the Center for Social Concerns: Kevin Allen, Todd Boroff, Molly Emmons, and Paula Muller. Such caring, committed colleagues are indeed a rare treasure. I am most grateful to all of them for their work here and elsewhere. And now to Professor Go. He is the Viola D. Hank Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. He's going to introduce today's honored guests. David Go is also the Vice President and Vice Provost for Strategic Initiatives at Notre Dame. Amongst his countless myriad of professional accomplishments, one to note for this group is that about 18 months ago, David co-founded the Character and Engineering Working Group here at Notre Dame with Professor Megan Levis, now Professor Megan Levis Scherer. And with that, thank you, David.
Thank you, Suzanne. First of all, I just want to say thank you all to attending this incredible conference over the next few days, for joining in these conversations, and on behalf of the Provost, we are honored by your presence and by your willingness to engage in these conversations. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to say a few words about why we're so honored. I think the challenge of whether education is transactional or foundational has been around for decades. I mean, it was certainly true even when I was an undergraduate student here at Notre Dame and before then. But it's been amplified to really extreme levels over the last several years. This has been including because of the pandemic that changed the way we learn in these spaces. There's been societal pressures such as the George Floyd murder or the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, political pressures to technological pressures and the advent of large language models, artificial intelligence, that are really putting an existential pressure on what is education today. And the fact that you are coming here to engage in that discussion and say there's more to this transactional element. There is this component of human flourishing and training and educating students to engage in their lives in meaningful ways, I think is not only powerful, but absolutely critical for society today. So from the deepest wells of my heart and on behalf of our entire university, thank you for engaging in these conversations. Thank you for participating, because it is really an important moment in time for humanity and for the world at large. So with that, I am very honored to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. David Brooks is a columnist for the New York Times and a contributor to The Atlantic. He's a commentator on the PBS Newshour, and he's done a myriad of work from working at the Wall Street Journal, being a senior editor at the Weekly Standard, a contributing editor at Newsweek and The Atlantic, commentator on a number of things, ranging from NPR to the PBS Newshour. He's also written a number of books, including The Second Mountain, The Quest for a Moral Life, The Road to Character, and The Social Animal, The Hidden Sources of Love, Character, and Achievement, all of which were #1 New York Times bestsellers. And his latest book is titled How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. He's also in many ways an academic, having taught at Yale and Duke and now the University of Chicago, and has received far more degrees than I have, over 30 honorary degrees from American universities, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please welcome David Brooks.
Thank you, David. I will now give a talk on aerospace. And thank you, Judy. I wasn't there at 1:30. I think that was Greg. But I was there at 11:30, and you were there to greet me. So I appreciate being here. I hope to set the Guinness World Record for preaching to the choir at this. I've been in the character world, teaching over 20 years at Yale and trying to teach character. I wrote a book called The Road to Character. I learned writing that book that writing a book on character doesn't actually give you good character. And even reading a book on it doesn't give you good character, but buying a book on character does give you good character. So I've always recommended that. But I really feel this is a moment when this field is, and this movement is just really taking off after 20 years. It used to be there were a few people doing this, and now every school I go to has people doing this. And when I got to Yale and started teaching there, they really didn't know what to do with me. And it was only because I'm not a real academic without a PhD that they could tolerate what I was doing there. But now, obviously, Miroslav Wolf is doing it. Obviously, a lot of people are doing it. And so there's just a tremendous sense of momentum. So I thought this would be a time, after being in this world for so long, to step back and try to organize the grand thinking. Like, where are we? What are we doing? And what exactly can universities do to enhance moral formation? Now, I know that universities can play a role in changing the souls of students because it happened to me. When I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. It was, as you know, a very cerebral school. My favorite saying about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so it's very cerebral. I fit right in. I had a double major in history and celibacy while I was there, and entered my college roommate in the Golden Gloves boxing competition. He had never boxed a day in his life, but we gave him a nickname, the Kosher Killer, and we trained the University of Chicago way, which was, we didn't actually try boxing, but we read a lot of books on boxing. And his illustrious career lasted 29 seconds. But it was a time when some of the old professors, refugees from World War II from Europe, had come to campus. And they believed in the great books, that if you read these books carefully and thought about them deeply, you would know how to live. And there was a guy named Karl Weintraub, who was a great scholar of Western civilization. And he wrote to a classmate of mine, "Sometimes when I've spent an hour or more pouring all my enthusiasm and sensitivities into an effort to tell these stories in the fullness which I see and experience them, I feel drained and exhausted. I think it works on the students, but I do not really know." And those of us have taught probably had that sense that sometimes you're pouring more into the students than they are yet able to receive, because they just haven't had enough life. But I can tell you of the generations of people who were influenced by Karl Weintraub and of so many professors. Somebody who was at Chicago a generation earlier than me, there was a guy named Joseph Epstein who became a great essayist. And he wrote of the faculty, "From the deep abyss of my late adolescent ignorance, I never for a moment thought I could hope to emulate such men and women. I nevertheless somehow sensed there was something immensely impressive about them. I mostly remember getting caught up in an immense admiration for these professors and these authors." And that's certainly how I felt. And so what did Chicago do for me? First, and I think for all of us, it welcomed us into a conversation of scholars, what Michael Oakeshott called the great conversation that has no end. And we were just little peons at the end, but we were part of this great conversation. Second, it introduced us to a range of history's moral ecologies, the great moral traditions from all different cultures. We tell our young people, find your own belief system, find out what you really believe. And if your name is Aristotle, maybe you can do that. The rest of us need to subscribe to somebody else's. And so we learned the Roman tradition of honor and glory, the Christian tradition of grace, Jewish tradition, Enlightenment rationalism, Buddhism, whatever. And they laid it all before us. And we got to choose. Third, they taught us how to see. John Ruskin, my father was a Ruskin scholar, once said, "The greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and to tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see." And it's the ability of a Tolstoy or of a George Eliot to see another human being clearly. That's the rarest of skills, and you only learn it from the masters. Fifth, they gave us emotional knowledge. To read Whitman as he exults in joy, Antigone as she tries to bury her brother, Galileo as he follows his discoveries, it's not necessarily to have new facts, but it's to have a new emotional experience. And so you ride along with these people. I remember one day I was in the library reading Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. And I fell into a trance. You know, Nietzsche's prose is like dynamic. He's writing about Dionysian passions. And 4 hours passed. And I totally lost track of where I was. And if you've ever been to the University of Chicago Library, it's the ugliest spot on the face of the earth. But once you've had that kind of experience, you want to have it again. And so Chicago gave us new things to love. New subjects, new fields, new sensations. And that to me is the greatest thing a school can do, is give students new things to love. Now Chicago, and what we are all inheritors of, is a great tradition of moral formation. Our founders, the America's founders, took a look at humanity and said these people are kind of completely amazing and mostly selfish. And if we're going to build a democracy out of these people, we better do moral formation. And so if you go back to their writings in the 18th century and 19th century, they were obsessed with it. They were obsessed with the idea, here's Noah Webster from 1788, "The virtues of men are of more consequence to society than their abilities. And for this reason, the hearts should be cultivated with more assiduity than the head." Hollis Frizell, the president of Hampton Institute, "Character is the main object of education." John Dewey, no right-winger, said, "Schools should teach morality every moment of the day, 5 days a week." The National Education Association, who we don't necessarily associate with being filled with moral fervor, wrote in 1951, "An unremitting concern for the moral and spiritual values continues to be the top priority for education." So for a long time, this was just in the water, that you had to do moral formation. And it came out in every form. The McGuffey Reader, W.E. Du Bois had a magazine, the Courtesy Club was at schools, the Thrift Club, the Knighthood of Youth, the YMCA, Aldo Leopold's Land Ethic. Some of it was secular, some was religious, some was right-wing, some was left-wing. But America was dense with morally formative institutions. The main thrust intellectually came out of Germany and then the Scandinavia, the Bildung movement, the idea that we had to create people with morally complex souls. The Bildung movement fed into, in this country, into the Great Books movement, which I benefited from, which Columbia, many of us benefited from. And it was this great moral tradition that these books were the keys to the kingdom. And it was just taken as natural that your job as an educator was to be moral formation. There was a guy who was the headmaster of the Stowe School, and he said, my job as a headmaster is to turn out students who are acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. And so it's people who you can count on when the times are done. One of my heroes was Frances Perkins. Now, she went to Mount Holyoke in 1905. And in 1905, they had rules you would probably not fly at Notre Dame in 2024. Freshmen shall bow in the presence of sophomores. Freshmen shall be, so that wouldn't fly. But they had a phrase, go where no one wants to go, do what no one wants to go. And Mount Holyoke fired these young women with a kind of moral intensity and a moral fervor. So if you look at the missionaries and the people doing social work in the 1920s abroad, some gigantic percentage of them were Mount Holyoke grads. And Frances Perkins spent her life doing worker safety and worker rights, fired by this. And one little thing about the Mount Holyoke education, her weakest subject was chemistry. So they thought character was more important than intellect, and so they forced her to major in chemistry. The idea being if you can major in your weakest subject, that'll be good for your discipline and your character. Again, it wouldn't work today, but it worked for them. Now these ideas, this whole movement was based on two underlying ideas. The first was that training the heart and the body was equally as important as training the mind. And the other underlying idea was that concepts like justice and right and wrong are not matters of personal taste, that there is an objective moral order. And that was underpinned a lot of the great sense of moral conviction. I should quote George Marsden here, writing about Martin Luther King. Marsden writes, what gave such widely compelling force to King's leadership and oratory was his bedrock conviction that moral law was built into the universe. That if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. If segregation is not wrong, nothing's wrong. And so they had this sense of conviction out of which grew a self-confidence. And then it went away. All these morally formative institutions went away, mostly. And why did they go away? Well, I'm going to tell you my story. My story is after World War II, people had to confront the Holocaust, some of the pits of human evil. And one school of thought said, see, this proves that human beings are fundamentally depraved at some level, and we really have to double down on moral formation. And I associate this tradition with Reinhold Niebuhr. Other people have a different view, which was people are good, but authority is bad. It's the external structures that are the problem here. And I associate this view with Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist. And if you go back right after World War II, there was a book by Joshua Liebman called Peace of Mind, which said human beings are good. Human nature is fundamentally good. And that sat on top of the New York Times bestseller list for 51 weeks. That was followed a few years later by The Power of Positive Thinking. Again, people are good. That sat on the New York Times bestseller list for 99 weeks. Still a record. Then Dr. Spock comes along, and so a different view of human nature comes on. We're good inside, corruption is out there. And if you're good inside, you don't have to do moral formation. You just have to reform the external things in society. And so all sorts of morally formative institutions turned into self-actualization institutions. And I recommend James Davison Hunter's book, The Death of Character, which is all about this, how institutions like the Girl Scouts started from moral formation, and by the end of the 1950s, they were get in touch with you, see who you are. And so some of that moral vocabulary drained away. There's a book called Moral Education in America by Edward McClellan. He writes, by the 1960s, deliberate moral education was in full-scale retreat. Educators poured more attention to the SAT scores of their students, and middle-class parents scrambled to find schools that would give their children the best chances to qualify for elite colleges and universities. And I don't know in your experience, in my experience, when there's a problem, the problem is the parents and not the students. Just once, I'd like a student to walk up to me and say, I really want to major in accounting. My parents are forcing me to major in French poetry. That will never happen. And you can measure these things. The 2012 paper, there was a cluster of words, these Google Ngrams, what words are common in the discourse. And so you see, after World War II, all sorts of morality words just drop in usage. Bravery drops 65%, gratitude drops 58%, humility drops 55%, and we began to see what you might call the privatization of morality. That people would say, morality is important, take care of it yourself. And so, and at the same time, universities fundamentally shifted. And my Bible on this is Tony Kronman's book, The End of Education, and he says, before universities adhered to the humanistic ideal, which is we turn out men and women of character. But by the 70s, universities followed the research ideal, which is we advance knowledge. And that's a great ideal, but Kronman says it turned the universities into these hyper-specialized places. We're asking the big questions. What is life for? What's the purpose of life? Kronman writes, not only were less likely to ask, but came to seem unprofessional to ask them. And I have a friend, and I've learned from 23andMe, he's my cousin, a guy at Harvard named Steven Pinker. And he says, listen, I've sat on 1 million hiring committees. We've never hired anybody for their ability to teach character. No one ever trained us to do this. We should not be doing this. And I think that became the prevailing view. Nonetheless, I'm convinced that's turning around, in part for the reasons David mentioned, in part because we're just in the middle of a spiritual and emotional and social crisis. Rising suicide rates, rising mental health problems. The number of people who say they have no close personal friends is up 4-fold since 2000. The number of people not in a romantic relationship is up by 1/3 since 2000. 45% of high school students say they're persistently hopeless and despondent. The number of people who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50% since 2000. It's just people don't treat each other with consideration and respect. And so social trust collapses. And the only way to rebuild social trust is to teach people how to treat each other with the inclination, both the open heart and also the social skills to treat each other with consideration and respect in trustworthy ways. And society is desperate for that. And so for those of us involved in this, it seems to me, first, we're condemned to start at the basics. So my students at Yale, I would often say they're wonderful kids. Of course, they're great kids. But I would tell them, I think you're morally inarticulate. Nobody's given you the vocabulary to think through. Words like redemption, grace, forgiveness, just don't have the vocabulary. And they completely agreed with that. One of my best moments teaching at Yale is I gave them all this vocabulary. And at the end, I had one kid who's a great student, and he was a Rhodes Scholar. And he comes up to me afterward and said, Professor Brooks, your class has made me much sadder. Because he was totally succeeding in the academic game. I gave him this other part of life which he wasn't succeeding at. And so that was a total win. And so to me, it's just reminding people just the essential importance of this. There's a quote from John Steinbeck I read from East of Eden. Humans are caught in their lives, in their thoughts, in their hungers and ambitions, in their avarice and cruelty, and in their kindness and generosity too, in a net of good and evil. I think this is the only story we have, and it occurs on all levels of feeling and intelligence. A man, or woman I should add, after he has brushed off the dust and chips of his life, will have left that one hard, clear question. Was it good or was it evil? And that just puts it right there. Iris Murdoch, another hero of mine, nothing in life as the importance of trying to become more virtuous is as important as the importance of trying to become more virtuous. And so putting that centrally is the first fundamental thing that has to be rebuilt. The second thing is, what is character? A lot of the terms that were clear in people's minds are now unclear in people's minds. I wrote this book, the Road to Character book, starting with this silly little dualism between the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. The resume virtues will make you good at your job. The eulogy virtues are things they say about you after you're dead, whether you're honest, courageous, capable of love. And that silly little dualism got seized upon because at least it gave people some vocabulary for understanding, career is not the same as what's going on inside. And I was struck the hunger for that. I found Angela Duckworth has contributed very helpfully at character.org. I think their website, which I used to follow, has gone offline. But in the final post, she sort of sums it all up, a whole body of research. And I thought her framing is a good way to explain to people what character is. She says you can dump virtues into 3 buckets. First, there are strengths of the heart, the ability to have considerate posture toward those around you. Then there are the strengths of the mind, being curious, open-minded, having good judgment and intellectual humility. And then there are strengths of the will, possessing self-control, grit, courage, and the growth mindset. That emphasis on 3 strengths, I think just speaking to a layperson, it lays it out reasonably clearly. It phrases it as strengths, and it gets you out of one of the core problems with the word character, which I'm deeply ambivalent about, is that it reminds everybody of patriarchal 19th century men. And so you've got to find new ways to reframe it so it doesn't sound like the patriarchy. And to me, so that's helpful in thinking about what character is. How do we think about what moral formation is? It sounds pompous. Who wants to be, I'm going to walk in a room and morally form other people? Like, kind of pompous. But I try to explain it using the gospel of Ted Lasso. If you remember the first season of that book, of that series, he's asked, what are your ambitions for FC Richmond, his football team? And he says, I'm just trying to help these young fellas be the best versions of themselves on and off the field. That's a pretty accessible definition of moral formation. Another way, a little more precise, is moral formation is about 3 basic things. Helping people restrain their selfishness, helping people find a purpose in life so they have something to shoot for, and teaching people how to treat each other with kindness and consideration. And those are 3 basic things. So let me do the last little bit here on what can a university do. Concretely, what can a university do to affect the character of the students? And I'll just put it I'm in for buckets since we're in that kind of taxonomy talk here. And so I'll mention 3 things, or 6 things. Sorry, the talk just got a little longer. 1, teach people to see, the act of attention. Simone Weil, I should mention her in her Catholic school. I don't know if she was really Catholic, but kind of in the neighborhood, said attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, the act of paying attention. I was reminded recently, I read about an interview that Dan Rather once did with Mother Teresa. And Dan Rather asked her, when you're praying, what do you ask for? What do you say to God? And she said, I don't say anything, I just listen. And Dan Rather says, well, what is God saying to you? And she says, he's not saying anything, he's just listening. And she says, if I can't explain that to you, if you don't get it, I can't explain that to you. But it is that emphasis that Simone Weil puts, and Iris Murdoch in her wake puts, on that power of casting attention. And I think Murdoch gets us out of a lot of the male ways of looking at character. Because a lot of male philosophers who had created these impregnable moral systems, but if you look at their lives, a lot of them had no kids, they were not married, they didn't really like other people. and Iris Murdoch brings us back to the morality of the everyday, building the systems of care that surround us in everyday life. And she says, mostly we go through life with self-centered eyes. And our goal should be to cast what she calls a just and loving attention on others. She says we can grow by looking, that act of looking. In my last book, I tell the story of a guy named Jimmy Durrell. I was down in Waco, Texas, and I'm having breakfast with a 93-year-old lady named LaRue Dorsey at a diner. And she presents herself to me as a strict, stern disciplinarian. And I'm a little intimidated by her. And into the diner walks Jimmy Durrell, a friend of both of ours. He's a pastor to the homeless. He has a church called Church Under the Bridge, under a highway overpass where the homeless live. And he sees us, and he walks up to our table, and he grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders, and he shakes her way harder than you should ever shake a 93-year-old. And he says to her, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best, I love you, I love you. And that stern disciplinarian I had been talking to turned to a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. He brought forth a different version of her with the power of his attention. And part of it's because he's a warmer personality than I am, but partly because he's a better Christian than I am. And so when he sees her, he sees someone made in the image of God. He sees someone with a soul of infinite value and dignity. He sees somebody so important, Jesus was willing to die for that person. And I tell people, you can be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, agnostic, Buddhist, I don't care. But seeing each person you meet with that level of reverence and respect is a precondition for treating them well. And so that's the power of attention. Parker Palmer, the educator, puts it in a more academic phrase, but useful. Every epistemology becomes an ethic. The shape of our knowledge becomes the shape of our living. The relation of the knower to the known becomes the relation of the living self to the larger world. How you know the world. If you see the world with fearful eyes, you'll find threat. If you see the world with critical eyes, you find flawed people. If you see the world with generous eyes, you see people doing the best they can. And this is in the Bible. Matthew, the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, our whole body will be full of light. The Bible is reasonably smart on this stuff. How do we teach people to see? Well, partly we do everything by example, but partly by teaching the arts. Emerson argued that we consume culture to enlarge our hearts and our minds. When you see the world through George Eliot's eyes, when you see the world through Tolstoy's eyes, you're seeing into the heart and experience of another human being. The liberal arts help us enter into the subjective experience of particular people, how this unique individual felt, how this other one longed and suffered. The novelist Frederick Buechner has a line. He once observed that not all faces that Rembrandt painted are remarkable, but even the plainest face is so remarkably seen by Rembrandt that it forces you to see it remarkably. And that generous eye of Rembrandt is like a model of all what art can do to teach you to see in a different world. I once was in St. Petersburg and I got to see the Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son, which Henry Nouwen wrote a whole book about. And he painted this one at the end of his life, Rembrandt did. He'd lost most of his children to death. His wife was dead. He was out of fashion, had lost much of his money. And I've seen people rendering that parable, the moment when the prodigal son comes back, but you can never see one where the boy is so broken and hairless and shoeless and ashamed. And you can never see one where the father is so patient and loving and warm. And you can just see this old guy wishing he could embrace his dead children. And you just see it in there. You have that experience. And if you look closely at the hands, as Nouwen points out, one hand is a masculine hand and one hand is a feminine hand around the boy. And so that just teaches you to see in a different way. The second thing we can do, and I think this is the easiest one, is to teach social skills. To me, the fun, like my students, as I say, they're great in every way, and they got into Yale and Chicago and places like that. But when they get to the dorm the first day, and they're messy and their roommate is neat, they do not know how to have that conversation. There's certain things that are basic social skills that have somehow gone untransmitted. How to be a good listener, how to end conversations gracefully, how to reveal vulnerability in an appropriate place, how to ask for and offer forgiveness, how to host a gathering where everybody feels included. I had one of my students said, I've had 4 boyfriends in my life, and at the end, all 4 of them ghosted me. Not one of them had the decency to have a breakup conversation. And I think maybe they were bad kids, but maybe they just didn't know how. And so teaching these basic social skills is like part of being a considerate, teaching people how to be considerate, how to ask good questions, how to be a great conversationalist. That's really what my last book is all about, just basic practical social skills, knowing how to show up for people. I had one of my students, I had her as a grad student named Jillian Sawyer, and when she was in college, her dad got pancreatic cancer, and he died shortly thereafter. And they had the conversation that he would probably not be around to see a lot of her big life events. A couple of summers later, she gets invited to be a bridesmaid at a friend's wedding. And so she sees the father of the bride at that wedding give a toast to his daughter. And then it comes time for the father-daughter dance. And she's sitting there at the reception. She thinks, I'm not really going to be able to hold it through this one. So she leaves the reception and goes off to the ladies' room to have a cry. When she gets out, all the people at her table and the adjacent table were standing there in the hallway. And she wrote a paper, which she's given me permission to quote. What I will remember forever is that no one said a word. Each person, including newer boyfriends who I knew less well, gave me a reaffirming hug and headed back to their table. No one lingered or awkwardly tried to validate my grief. They were there for me, just for a moment, and it was exactly what I needed. Somebody at one of those two tables had said, let's go to the hallway and be there for Jillian. Somebody taught the kid to do that. And so these are the kind of social skills. And I would include marrying skills. I talk to my students a lot about your happiness in life. The social science is clear on this, is 4 times more powerfully going to be influenced by your marriage than by your job, your sex life, your income, or your professional success. These are just tons of social science statistics. So my view is that every class you teach in college should be about marriage. It should be the sociology of marriage, the neuroscience of marriage, whatever. It should be about marriage. And one of my students said, marriage is a box that will come in the mail when I'm 35. I'm like, nah, you should start thinking about it now. Like, read Jane Austen, read George Eliot, learn from the masters. And how to be a good spouse, that's really going to be key to your life. And somehow, it's easy to repair. Just assign them George Eliot. Or, I don't know, it's a religious book, but it's a good book on marriage by Tim and Kathy Keller. I think it's called The Reason for Marriage. I forget what it's called. And they said when you're 6 months into a marriage, you realize the wonderful person you married is actually kind of selfish. And as you're making that realization, they're making that of you. And so a good marriage is when both people decide, well, my own selfishness is the only one I can handle here. And so if both people handle that. And then there are just practical tips. I read a blog post. I don't know why I'm quoting this now, but I am going to. It's like, to create a good marriage, brag about your spouse and have them overhear you bragging. Like, that's a good way to work on your marriage. Another tip was, they tell you never go to bed mad. Sometimes just go to bed. You wake up, you make breakfast, you'll feel better. Another one is, if you have to bitch to him, bitch to his mother, not to yours. Because his mother will forgive him and yours never will. So, so these are like practical tips. The third thing we do is create a moral ecology. Again, I'm borrowing a James Davison Hunter phrase. I wrote a column about how hard it was to teach morality in a classroom. And a guy named Dave Jolly, was a veterinarian, wrote me an email, and he says, never forget, what a wise person teaches is the smallest part of what they give. The totality of their life, the way they go about it in the smallest detail is what gets transmitted. Never forget that. The message is the person, perfected over lifetimes of effort that was set in motion by yet another wise person, now hidden from the dim mists of time. The message is the person. And that's true for those of us in the classroom. Well, students remember, I don't remember a lot of what my professor said, but I remember how they were. And for my first 10 years on this show, the PBS Newshour, I worked for a guy named Jim Lehrer. And when I said something he thought was smart and nice and helped the show, I could see his eyes crinkle with pleasure. When I said something crass or stupid, I could see his mouth turn down with displeasure. So for 10 years, I tried to chase the eye crinkle and avoid the mouth downturn. He never said anything to me. But with those small gestures, he communicated, this is how we do things at the NewsHour. And he not only communicated to me, but to everybody on the team. And now Jim has been dead for, 7 or 8 years. But we still do things by the Lehrer moral ecology. And it lives on after communicated in the way people are in the smallest gesture of their being. I can't go a talk without quoting my hero Edmund Burke on the importance of these small gestures. Manners are more important than laws. Upon them, in great measure, the law depends. The law touches us but here and there, now and then. Manners are what vex and soothe, corrupt and purify, exalt or debase, barbarize and refine us. By a constant stream of steady, uniform, insensible operation, like that of the air we breathe, they give whole form and color to our lives. According to their quality, they add morals, they supply them, or they totally destroy them. It's just the little gestures and the little way we are with each other. So that's the idea of creating a moral ecology. The fourth, and the one that I think we do best, is exemplars, holding up exemplars. I once read about a Spartan educator who said, my job as an educator is to make excellence pleasurable to children. Just to tell stories that hold people up and that lift them and set, if we're going to fail, it's not because we had an inadequate ideal. And so when I would teach 14 books, And at the end of the term, one year, I said, okay, pick one of the 14 books, apply it to a problem in your own life. And one of the books that I taught of the 14, and this was at Yale, a very secular place, was Dorothy Day's book, The Long Loneliness. And of the 24 students in my class, who were vast array, I'm not sure any of them were Catholic, 19 out of the 24 picked Dorothy Day. Her commitment to the poor, her commitment to service of the poor, her emotionality, it just touched them. And I think what touched them especially was they were fascinated by her finding of faith. And if I can remember the quote, the moment when her daughter was born, she realized she needed somebody to thank. I'm going to butcher it, but it's something, she wrote something like, if I had composed the greatest symphony, sculpted the greatest sculpture, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I felt when they placed my child in my arms. With that came a need to worship and to adore. And of course, students are transfixed by that, whether they're religious or not, or find religious, but just the sense of somebody just transformed. And then at the end, the other thing that I remember one of my students wrote about was at the end of her life, Robert Coles, asked her, do you ever think of writing a memoir? And she says, yeah, I thought about it. This was at the very end of her life. And she said, yeah, I sat there with a legal pad and I wrote on the top, A Life Remembered. And I thought of the Lord and his visit to us all those centuries ago. And I was just grateful to have had him on my mind all that time. And I didn't need to write anything. And so that image struck them tranquility. Like how many of us get to experience tranquility? And so again, an exemplar embodies an ideal. The fifth, and I'll close up, is the act of self-confrontation. The idea that each of us has a chief sin and that we need to confront that sin. And if you looked at people like Dwight Eisenhower, when he was 9, he wanted to go trick-or-treating and his mom wouldn't let him. So he threw a temper tantrum and punched the tree in his front yard. And he punched it so hard he rubbed all the skin off his knuckles. And his mom sent him to his room, came up after an hour to bind his wounds, and said to him, recited a verse from Proverbs, he who conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city. And 50 years later, Eisenhower said that was the most important conversation of his life because it taught him that he had a problem, which was his rage. And we think of Eisenhower as this garrulous country club kind of guy. That was created, that was manufactured. He battled his anger and his hatreds for the entire course of his life. And so in World War II, he would stay up nights, his throat pulsing, smoking like a maniac, and he would think of all the people that day he'd hated. And he would write out these lists of all these bastards, and then he would rip them up and throw into the garbage can as a way to purge his anger. But that act of self-confrontation, of admitting your own sinfulness and saying, what do I got to work on here? And how do I work on that? That's the penultimate thing I'll mention. And then the final thing is just attachment to ideals and through moral discourse. And this is what so many of the courses I encounter, the How to Live course at Yale, Life Worth Living, which I think is here, or no, Notre Dame is called God and the Good Life, I think. And that's just getting people in the habit of debating about moral dilemmas, what a moral ideal is, what it looks like when a moral ideal clashes with another ideal, just intellectually conversing. And so really what I've tried to do is like, what business are we in here? What situation are we in, which I think is a rising tide. Next year, you're gonna have to get a much bigger room. And then, what can a university do? And the final word I'll leave you with is, and I think David mentioned this, part of the reason that people are so interested in virtue and character and moral formation is that we just live in a brutalizing time. It's just brutalizing. The famous ages of our century are terrible ages. September 11th, January 6th, October 7th. Like, wow, what a great century. And there's a tendency to one of two ways, which is to either callous up, grow distrustful, grow cynical, which is what a lot of people have done. And if you want to live that way, Again, I quote Frederick Buechner, if you cut yourself off from the most intimate parts of yourself, you're cutting yourself off from the holy sources of life itself. Just not a good way to live. The other alternative was exemplified to me one night at a bar, and it was about sometime in November, I guess, and I was at a bar late at night, and if you had seen me, you would have said, sad guy drinking alone. But I call it reporting. And so I'm scrolling through all these images, and they're horrible images from Gaza in the Middle East. And I come across a different image, which was of a little video of James Baldwin. And he, it looked like from the black and white quality, it was like early 60s. And he's saying to an unseen interviewer, there may not be as much humanity in the world as one would like to see, but there is some. There is more than one would think. Walk down the street of any city, any afternoon, and look around you. What you've got to remember is what you're looking at is also you. Everyone you're looking at is also you. You could be that person, you could be that monster, you could be that saint, and you have to decide for yourself not to be. And when I looked at that video, especially in the context of all the horrible, James Baldwin was treated pretty horribly by our society. And there would have been a temptation to harden over and to get cynical. And yet here was a guy, even in the midst of this, who was saying, look down at the person you meet, that could be you, that could be you, you could be that person. And the phrase that leapt into my head was defiant humanism. That even in ugly times, he was going to insist, and even against the waves of injustice that he experienced, he was going to insist on being human, seeing other people as human, and try to live a life of basic decency. And it seems to me that's the choice on offer for us. So thank you.
I think Aaron and Judy have microphones. Jump in.
Excellent. Thank you so much. My name is Sarah Schnicker. I'm a personality and social psychologist from Baylor, so good old Waco. I was really struck by your explanation of why character went out of favor after World War II, and very much resonates, especially in social psychology, where it's all about the situation and not the person. And this is something I encounter as I publish in academic journals, this resistance to want to say that the person matters too. I'm curious, when you presented this to people, especially to psychologists perhaps, how you have tried to convince, what do you do to convince them that we still need to focus on the person and individual moral formation alongside structural change?
Right. Well, I do think, it's your field, not mine, but my understanding is that social or psychology has reached a truce in the war over situation versus the person. So they're both important. But I think various people have helped, and a range of people. In writing my last book, I got to know a therapist named Mary Pfeiffer. And she's a therapist in Nebraska. She wrote a book back in the early feminism, I think called Orpheus or something like that. Yeah. And she said, my method is to have no method. And she just treats people with generosity. And she described to me how she does it. It's just like the spirit of generosity. But then I think on social psychology, I think Jonathan Haidt has helped. I think there's more work here. And I would just mention, I have a friend, this is all public, he's written about this. His name is James Mumford. And he wrote a piece in, it might have been Hedgehog Review or some magazine, about his time in a mental health institution. And he kept saying to them, a lot of my problem is existential. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know my purpose. I feel my soul is injured. And they refused. They said, no, that's not it. And they refused to engage in any kind of moral conversation with him. And he kept saying to them, you're not helping me. And I'm a believer in, to go back to an early form of psychology, I am a believer in Viktor Frankl. Like, the fundamental human drive is for meaning. And he quotes Nietzsche, "He who has a why to live for can endure anyhow." That if you know what your purpose is, then you know what you could handle the rough spots. And so I found my sense is in your field, which I really got into for this last book, there was a lot less resistance than there might have been 10 years ago.
Thank you.
David, thank you. It's just always such a blessing to hear you, whether it's in person or or watching you otherwise. But I am the father of an 18-year-old who's going off to college, and so this is, I always say it's youth ministry for real in my house. And so I'm doing a lot of thinking about like adolescence, like where he's come in the last 4 years, and my experience of parenting him. He's incredibly bright. He's smarter than me. Is that I have just done everything I could to sort of hold the center. That he gravitates to extremes, and I think a lot of young people today, for all kinds of reasons, are gravitating towards extremes. There's moral clarity in the extremes. There's community in the extremes. There's a sense of purpose in the extremes. And being a parent these days and trying to hold space and implement practices that help deepen the soul and the character. And I feel like he got there. He's majoring in theology and linguistics, and he sort of has this strong moral compass. But man, it wasn't me. Like I feel like there's this sort of community. Anyway, my question is, I didn't hear you say a lot about parenting, and I'm sure that that's in there. I wonder if you could say a bit about how you're thinking about parenting as it relates to character.
Yeah. First, I have a son like that. So I sent him to one of these super, uber, duper progressive elite schools in Washington, D.C. I sent all my kids to these kinds of schools, and they've all rebelled against it. So the idea of being in the upper middle class, bourgeois, we must get into Princeton, they found that all abhorrent. And so one went here to IU, and one went out to University of Colorado, one went out to California. They all like, screw that, they were all athletes despite my gene pool. And they all said, our sports friends are better than our school friends. And so they're all doing normal things outside that pressure cooker. But I had one student who, at the super progressive school, of course, he turned into a Trumpy. But then he turned into a Marxist when he went to the new school. Then he turned into, he was all over. And a lot of my sense of that was, intense social distrust. Like, he's sort of a populist now who hangs around hip-hop artists. And what do those two very different parts of our culture have in common? Intense suspicion of all structures of authority and prone to conspiracy thinking. And so that innate hostility to authority is very strong in him and a lot of people. He'll send me texts after my columns appear. How much do I have to pay you to stop writing? Like, it's just like, I should say you can't afford it. But I think the one thing there is intense sense of overwhelm. And when that sense of overwhelm leads to a fear of complexity, and just like make it clear. And I think that's why the gravitation. But then the other thing, and somehow, I'm not sure how, somehow this may be my next book, we've put them in this world where we sort them at age 18. And we've created a meritocracy based on really a form of segregation by IQ, which A, has destroyed our society because it's split us into educated and non-educated classes. B, it's put intense pressure to feel between the ages of 15 and 25, my whole life is going to be set. And so somehow we have to find a way to define human ability as more than just being able to please teachers at age 17. And IQ is important, but it's not as important as the ability to work on teams. It's not as important as the ability to be a lifelong learner. And I tell my students at Yale, 70% of you are going to be more boring at 30 than you are right now. Because you're right now under the spell of some great teachers, but you're not going to be a good self-teacher. You're not going to be asking yourself the big questions. And so try not to be in that 70%. But what I try to do with my kids is to slow it down. Like, you don't have to have it all set at 22. You don't have to be on a life course. And I told them, I give them permission, and this is an expensive proposition, so I don't always recommend it. Like, do 3 fascinating things in your 20s. They don't have to have anything to do with each other, and they don't have to be part of a plan. And my older boy is now in 30s and now is fine to spout, but he was like a kindergarten teacher. He served in the military. He was a baseball coach. 3 radically different things that he feels behind. But I said, you're going to be probably working till you're 75. You have plenty of time. And so my only advice that comes to mind as a parent is just to slow things down and give them permission to take their time. Because the pressures upon them are so, so incredible. Like, not only could we have got into the schools we teach at, we didn't know anybody who could get into these schools. My students have all like unicycled across Thailand while reading The Lepers. Like, they've all done all this stuff. So I just try to take the pressure off. And the other final thing I'll say, and again, we all have experience with students, but I find there's just an epidemic of conditional love among about 30% of my students, that when they do things, their parents love them, but when they do things their parents think are good for their careers, the beam of love is a little stronger. And when they do things they think deviate, the beam of love can vanish. I'll have quicker answers.
Hi. John Wilson. I was in my first year as President Morehouse when I encountered you at the CIC meeting. Yeah. My question is about the urgency of the moment. I'm in an effort very much like this at Notre Dame, Virtues Vocations, at MIT, at the MIT Media Lab. And when we talk with people, potential supporters, there's a theme emerging, and that is it's too late. That the pace of change, if you try to teach it 1 year at a time to people who spend 4 years in college and then it'll take too long. And I hear that. I wrote a book called Hope and Healing, and I asked, why didn't the civil rights movement happen 100 years before it did? Yeah. Why didn't the graduates of Yale and Harvard, after Reconstruction went down, why didn't they pull that off? And it's because this has been dullened in higher education long before I think you said it was. So what do you say to people who think that we have chosen the wrong venue for the change we're trying to pull off, that it will take far too long? This is not a matter of urgency, it's an emergency.
So are you saying we need to start younger, or?
I think we need to start younger. We need to start at ages 2 to 99. I don't think it's...
Yeah. So I 100% agree that we think still too much in terms of there's the period of education and then there's the career, like boom. But that never, like lifelong learning is the central skill. I tried to say that at the very end. And I agree with you starting at 2. I think parents are trying. I'm not sure they've been given the equipment to know how to talk about this stuff. That's why they seize onto academic or sports accomplishment, because at least it's a criteria. And then, of course, when you're in a community where there's less civic engagement, and less church attendance, and less synagogue attendance, mosque, then you're further denuding. But I would start, frankly, the schools do a little social and emotional learning, of course. I think they could do a lot more of that. We've had this conversation. Some institutions are morally formative, and some are not. Some are thick, and some are thin. And every time I have a different talk I give on what institutions are thick and what are thin. I think you may have heard me once. Morehouse men are like, the Marine Corps and the Morehouse is like a quintessential Mount Holyoke for Francis Perkins. And I've worked with a Morehouse man on the PBS Newshour, a guy named Jeff Bennett, and he's a Morehouse man in 30 seconds into meeting him. And I'm been active with a predecessor of yours, Walter Massey. It's because it has a thick culture. And there are some cultures, some schools, you go to Notre Dame, they weren't to Notre Dame. And some are, like Oberlin, they went to Oberlin. I'm a fan of a little small school called Kenyon, Indiana, Valparaiso. Some schools have a thick culture. They're not afraid of being distinct. The people see each other before breakfast and after dinner. They do music together. They often have a sacred origin story. They have rituals that mark the transitions. They have a sense of solidarity. They often have a near-death experience, which we recovered from. And so there's a way to build a thick institution. And a lot of institutions have sort of drifted away from that as they become atomized. And a lot of schools are just like each other. My wife went to a little school in the Midwest called Wheaton College, sort of a Christian college. And now if I'm giving a talk and a 22-year-old comes up to me and asks me an extremely painfully, morally earnest question, I say, did you go to Wheaton by any chance? And, and I have a good hit rate. So to me, it's creating those kind of moral ecologies all the way through life. I'm 62, I need it. We all need to be surrounded by these all-embracing moral cultures. So thank you for what you do.
Can we have one last question?
Okay.
So I'm a professor in engineering, and I see this in my children's middle school, and I see it, increasing trends and pushes towards STEM, which from a job security perspective is great. But one of the things that I always find interesting is there's a lot of pressure on us to teach very technical courses, to teach very specific things. You survey employers, they want more and more of these kind of things. And yet, when I talk to all of these employers, I'm like, oh, you hired such and such, how's that working out? It's almost always a character value or something about them that is the thing that they really want and see. And I'm just curious, what's your perspective on how do we, as engineering educators and on the STEM side, how do we promote to the world that these parts are just as important to being a strong engineer, to being a strong scientist, to being an overall human being?
Yeah. Well, obviously STEM produces great careers and great technical knowledge, but if you look at salaries, say, English and philosophy majors have a disadvantage for the first 5 years, but a lot of them catch up subsequently. And if you look at why people are fired from firms, somebody did this study, I think 89,000 people were fired. In 11% of the cases, it was because the person was fired because he lacked the technical or intellectual abilities to do the job. But in 89% of the cases, it was because he was not teachable. He was not a good team player. He was an asshole. It's moral problems in 89% of the firings. And then if you look at productivity, we lionize IQ in prestigious schools, but McKinsey, or one of the consulting firms, did a study of their Yale grads and their Cleveland State grads. And the Yale grads were 1.9% more productive than the Cleveland State grads. It's just crazy. We have this system where it's like 18th century royal families. We somehow have a status distinction between Penn and Penn State. These are all good schools, but we make these bifurcations that will look insane in 50 years. And so to me, what has to happen is parents will do what universities ask for. And a decade or two ago, Berkeley said, we want to see a community service. And so every kid who wanted to get into Berkeley started an orphanage. And so we need to redefine how people are judged by the things that really matter, by the ability to work on teams, by the ability, as I said, to be curious, to be dogged, to be hungry for knowledge. When we actually count those things, and they're project-based high schools where people work on teams, they have projects. And then instead of having grades in a formal sense, they do what looks like a dissertation defense. It's a project defense. And to me, especially with AI, to be able to do a project with a group of people and then defend it coherently, that's just a great skill. One of the problems we have is we direct people for a life that doesn't exist. We select people by their ability to do well in school. But their ability to do well in school does not correlate with their ability to do well in life. The correlation between college and high school grades and life outcomes is near zero. Because in school, you're like responding to extrinsic rewards, getting grades, getting class rank. But in life, intrinsic rewards are a lot more important. So finding, like, being ability to be totally self-motivated and the ability to be iconoclastic and to really be committed to the people around you. And those things are actually way more practical. And so, and then finally, I'll end here on my rants, but this is my next rant. Like everything that AI does is what being a school is all about. Like AI is pretty good at taking the SATs and the LSATs and the MCATs. And AI is really good at writing a paper that can get A's at Harvard. That's not a good measure because every paper gets A's at Harvard. But so AI is going to replace those sides of us. And so it seems to me we're going to learn out what being human is by learning what AI can't do. And we have to focus on that. And that's really the pivot for higher ed, is to select for things that are now being ignored and amputated and neglected because of the focus on what's easiest to measure and count. And so to me, that's a revolution in the weighting. And certainly some sense of moral compunction and part of being showing that you've been a decent person. Somehow, I don't know how you measure that thing, but peers, teachers, reports. I mean, we should judge people by the stories people tell about them, not the grades. And that's a revolution waiting to happen. Thank you so much for your attention.